All right, tonight we're diving into something that'll make you really grateful for the warm showers you've been taking. We're stepping back into Victorian hygiene, a world where glamour met grime. And trust me, it's a story you'll want to hear. Imagine those polished top hats, dazzling gowns, and refined manners. Now peel back the curtain and let's just say it wasn't all rosy underneath. Curious? You should be. Oh, and before we dive in, let me know where you're tuning in from. It always blows my mind to think people all over the world are settling in with these stories. Hit the like or subscribe if you're enjoying this little trip back in time. Now, take a deep breath, find your coziest spot, and let yourself sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to the 1850s, Victorian London, to be exact. And by the end of this, you'll be so glad for your mattress. Congratulations, you've just woken up in Victorian London. The first thing to hit you isn't the sights, it's the smell. It's a thick, heavy scent that clings to everything. Think of this, a mix of human waste, rotting garbage, coal smoke, and something faintly sweet but disturbingly wrong. It sticks to the back of your throat like bad perfume you can't escape. You shift in your bed, or what counts as a bed, and immediately notice the difference. The sheets, if you're lucky to have them, feel rough against your skin, like sandpaper. The smell? Let's just say there's no such thing as fabric softener yet. Good news, you're alive. Bad news, just about everything else. Let's talk about where you are. If you're poor, which most people were, you're crammed into a tiny room about the size of a modern kitchen, and you're not alone. 6, maybe 8 people are squeezed in there with you. Family, strangers, doesn't matter. Privacy. That's a luxury for the rich. The walls are damp, always damp. There's this greenish mold creeping in the corners. No one talks about it, but it's definitely there, silently judging everyone. Now, if you're middle class, things are slightly better. You might have your own room, your own bed even. But don't get too comfortable. There's no running water, no electricity. And that bathroom you're picturing? Yeah, that's not happening. Here's the wild part. Everyone thinks they're clean. They genuinely believe they've nailed hygiene. But their idea of clean? It's a little off by today's standards. Let's talk about bathing. Forget your daily shower. Victorians thought bathing too much was dangerous. They believed it could weaken your body, maybe even make you sick. If you were wealthy, a full bath was a once-a-week event. If you were poor, maybe once a month, maybe. But they weren't completely skipping hygiene. They had a system. Enter the sponge bath. It was all about the essentials: face, hands, armpits, and, the parts that needed attention. That was it. Feeling grateful for your hot shower yet? Hold on to that feeling. Because there's so much more to this story. What about the other things? That could wait until the rare bath day. Now, picture yourself standing in your tiny bedroom, next to a wooden stand, holding a bowl and a pitcher of freezing water. Hot water on demand? Forget about it, it's practically wizardry in Victorian times. You pour the cold water into the tub, grab a sponge or cloth, and start cleaning just the essentials. It's less of a bath, and more like giving your car a quick wipe if your car were your body. Take a moment to imagine mornings like this. A far cry from your modern daily shower, isn't it? If you were wealthy, things might have been slightly better. You could have a shiny copper bathtub, and servants would lug boiling water upstairs to fill it. But bathing daily? Not a chance. Twice a week was considered extreme hygiene. And here's the best and the worst part. Families reused the same bathwater. Dad went first, followed by Mom, then the kids in order of age. By the time the youngest one got his turn, let's just say the water turned into stew. Can you believe there were actual books in the 1850s teaching people how to bathe? Yup, bath manuals were a thing. They even warned against washing your face while traveling unless you purified the water first, or alternating hot and cold water to prevent wrinkles. Sounds exhausting, doesn't it? And teeth? Oh, Victorian dental care was a real adventure. Toothbrushes existed, but they weren't exactly affordable or effective. Imagine scrubbing your teeth with a tiny wooden brush fitted with stiff animal hair. Poor folks got inventive. Some chewed on celery to clean their teeth, while others whipped up their own toothpaste using chalk, soot, or even powdered cuttlefish bone. Got a toothache? Brace yourself. No dentist in sight? You'd head to the barber or even the local blacksmith. Yes, the same person who trimmed hair or shoed horses would yank out your tooth with zero anesthesia and zero finesse. The word painful doesn't even begin to describe it. Now let's talk about hair care. Shampoo? What's that? Women used whatever was lying around, eggs, vinegar, rum, or even tea, to clean their hair. And washing? Maybe once a month? To keep their hair healthy, or so they thought. They applied oils and pomades, which eventually turned rancid. The result? Hair that smelled, well, not great. Laundry was its own nightmare. Without washing machines, every piece of clothing had to be scrubbed by hand. Soap was pricey, so people used odd substitutes, chalk for stains, kerosene for blood, and even urine for bleaching. Yes, human urine. A single wash day could take hours, if not the whole day. So most families only washed their clothes once a week, sometimes even less. And underwear, many poor folks didn't bother with it. Wealthy people had linen undergarments, but even those weren't changed often. Meanwhile, women wore layer upon layer, corsets, petticoats, and heavy dresses, all of which soaked up sweat, smoke, and every odor they encountered. Now imagine walking down a summer street in London, hundreds of people wearing unwashed clothing, smelling like coal smoke, food, manure, and themselves. The stench, overwhelming. It wasn't just a smell, it was a presence in the air you couldn't escape, but personal hygiene was just one part of it. The streets? They were something else entirely. London in the 1850s had over 2 million residents. Garbage collection? Non-existent. People dumped their trash in the streets, where it rotted and drew rats. Human waste? That went into chamber pots, which were either emptied into cesspools or tossed straight out the window. And where did it all end up? In the Thames, the very same river people drank from. Horses added to the mess. Thousands of them roamed the streets, each producing around 35 pounds of manure every day. Rain turned the roads into rivers of filth. Dry spells transformed the waste into dust clouds that people breathed in constantly. Hard to imagine living in such conditions, isn't it? Yet, for the Victorians, this was normal. Everyone walked through it, lived in it, and didn't think twice because, well, everyone smelled the same. When everyone around you lives in filth, filth starts to feel normal. Strange, right? You're lying there, sinking deeper into your mattress, letting your muscles relax and feeling lucky. Lucky to live in a time with running water, soap, and actual garbage collection. But the Victorians? They didn't have that luxury. They weren't clueless either. They knew their surroundings were unpleasant. They just didn't quite grasp why. People kept falling sick. Wait as the miasma theory is waiting for you. They believed diseases were spread through bad air, awful smells. Makes sense, right? If you could smell something disgusting, surely it could make you sick. They weren't entirely wrong. Bad smells often meant poor sanitation, and poor sanitation led to disease. But they thought the smell itself was the villain, not the rotting filth behind it. So, what did they do? Perfume. Buckets and buckets of it. The rich drenched themselves in lavish fragrances. The poor made do with cheap cologne or crushed herbs. But the truth is, covering the stink of unwashed bodies, soiled clothes, and sewage-filled streets with perfume didn't solve the problem. It created a nightmare. Imagine vanilla air freshener mixed with, well, a pile of poops. That was Victorian high society, a sweet, sickening cloud of denial. And then there were the women. Oh, they had it rough. Their clothing was a maze of layers, heavy skirts dragging through streets, corsets squeezing the life out of them. And makeup? That wasn't any better. Powder laced with lead, rouge spiked with mercury. They were poisoning themselves in the name of beauty. Even their hair dye was deadly. A popular product called Hall's Hair Renewer promised to bring back youthful color. The secret ingredient? Lead. They rubbed it right into their scalps, never connecting the dots between their constant illnesses and their quest for beauty. And skincare. Let's just say it was creative. Lemon juice to bleach freckles, butter for dry skin, and raw meat as face masks. That's right. People went to bed with slices of beef on their faces, convinced it would keep them youthful. Can you imagine the smell of a wealthy Victorian's bedroom? Raw meat, rancid pomade, unwashed bodies, and the overwhelming perfume trying to mask it all. But you know what? They were doing their best. They adapted, worked with what they had, and found ways to feel clean and attractive, even if their methods were questionable. In a way, it's admirable. Of course, the wealthy had servants to handle the mess, maids for chamber pots, laundresses for the mountain of clothes, and bath attendants to lug buckets of water. But the servants? They were usually even filthier than their employers. When you're cleaning someone else's mess all day, your hygiene takes a back seat. And the poor? Well, they didn't have the luxury of worrying about cleanliness. Survival came first. Enough food, rent, coal for warmth. Staying clean was a privilege, not a priority. Can you imagine living in a world where taking a bath was a big event? Where brushing your teeth was a luxury? Where clean water wasn't given? They'd probably think we're nuts with our daily showers and hand washing. But let's talk about toilets, or the lack of them. Picture your bathroom, the running water, the soft toilet paper, the clean seat. Now erase all of that. For most Victorians, toilets were wooden shacks shared by dozens of families. Just a hole in the ground buzzing with flies and an unbearable stench, especially in summer. The rich had water closets. Sounds fancy, right? But without modern plumbing, where did the waste go? Straight into a cesspool in the basement. Yeah, a pit of sewage fermenting under the house. If the cesspool overflowed, the smell would rise through the floorboards, making people sick from the fumes. And when it got too much, the night soil men come in. These guys emptied cesspools under the cover of darkness because the job was too revolting for daylight. These night soil men, what a job they had. Imagine this. Armed with shovels and buckets, they descended into the cesspools of Victorian London. Their task? To haul up human waste, bucket by reeking bucket, and load it onto carts. The stench was beyond description, a thick, suffocating fog of decay. Neighbors would slam their windows shut, stuff rags under their doors. but it was no use. The smell seeped in anyway, clinging to everything. But here's where it gets interesting. That waste wasn't just dumped. No, it was valuable. Farmers needed fertilizer, and human waste was a cheap and effective option. So the night soil men carted it out to the countryside, where it was sold and spread across fields. And those fields, they grew the vegetables that ended up on dinner plates. That's right, Victorians ate food grown in the very waste that fueled cholera and typhoid outbreaks. The cycle was as grim as it was revolting. By the 1850s, though, this system was falling apart. London was growing too fast. Too many people meant too much waste. And the night soil men simply couldn't keep up. Cesspools overflowed. Streets flooded with sewage whenever it rained. The smell worsened, diseases spread faster, and people began to panic. Some gave up on cesspools altogether. Instead, they dumped chamber pots out of windows, into streets, or directly into rivers and streams. And where did those streams flow? Right into the Thames, London's primary source of drinking water. Yes, people were drinking water contaminated with their own waste, and they couldn't figure out why everyone was getting sick. It wasn't as if the problem went unnoticed. Scientists and government officials knew something had to be done. And anyone with a working nose could tell you the city was drowning in its own filth. But solutions? That was the sticking point. Some thought the answer was more cesspools. Others argued for dumping everything into the Thames and letting it flow away. Still, there were people that shrugged and said, London's always smelled bad. Why bother changing now? Then came the summer of 1858, the infamous Great Stink. It was hot, scorchingly so. Day after day of relentless sun, with no rain to wash away the grime. The Thames dropped to alarmingly low levels, exposing layers of sewage that had accumulated along the riverbanks. Under the blazing sun, the filth began to ferment. The resulting stench was indescribable, a miasma that blanketed the city and turned stomachs at every corner. People walking near the river vomited from the smell. Families abandoned homes that were too close to the water. The press dubbed it the Great Stink, and Charles Dickens himself wrote about the Thames, calling it a deadly sewer rather than a river. Scientists dropped white paper into the water to measure its cleanliness, only to watch it disappear into a brown, soupy mess within seconds. But what finally pushed the city to act wasn't the suffering of the public, or even the alarming death toll from disease. No, it was Parliament. The Houses of Parliament sat right on the banks of the Thames, and with the summer heat, the smell poured into their chambers through open windows. Politicians gagged, pressed handkerchiefs to their noses, and debated abandoning Westminster altogether. They tried soaking curtains in lime and chloride to mask the odor, but nothing worked. The stench was inescapable. That's when they decided to act. Enter Joseph Basil Gett. Imagine being handed the impossible task. Hey Joe, fix London's sewage problem. And oh, did it yesterday. But Basil Gett wasn't just anyone. He was a brilliant engineer with a knack for ambitious projects, and his solution wasn't to patch up the failing system. It was to replace it entirely. His plan was revolutionary. Build a completely new sewer network for the entire city. Smaller sewers would run under every street, connecting to massive intercepting sewers that carried waste far downstream. 8 miles from the city, the waste would be dumped into the Thames at high tide, sparing the city itself from the stench and contamination. The scale of the project was staggering. Over 1,000 miles of new sewers had to be built, along with embankments along the Thames to house the larger intercepting sewers. Streets were torn apart, neighborhoods demolished, and thousands of families displaced to make way for the construction. Massive pumping stations were needed to move sewage uphill, and millions of bricks were used to line the tunnels. And the cost? Eye-watering. In today's terms, the project would have cost billions, possibly tens of billions. Taxes were raised, bonds were issued, and loans taken. People complained loudly about the expense, but there was no alternative. The city was on the brink of collapse. The work was grueling. Laborers dug deep into the earth, battling not just mud, but the stench of raw sewage and the constant threat of cave-ins. The noise of construction echoed through the city day and night, and the smell of cement and brick dust mingled with the lingering odors of waste. But when the system finally went live, the transformation was immediate. The stench disappeared. The Thames began to run cleaner. Cholera outbreaks dwindled, and disease rates plummeted. For the first time in decades, people could walk along the river without holding their breath. It was nothing short of miraculous. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Raw sewage was still being dumped into the Thames, just farther downstream, where it became someone else's problem. And poorer neighborhoods often had to wait years to be connected to the new network, enduring overflowing cesspools and sewage-laden streets in the meantime. Still, the improvements were undeniable. Public health across the city improved dramatically. Typhoid rates dropped, cholera became less frequent, and life expectancy began to rise. And yet, there were still some challenges left to tackle. Take toilet paper, for instance. That wasn't widely available until the 1870s, and even then, it was expensive and uncommon. So, what did people use before then? The answer: whatever they could find. Newspapers, rags, or even leaves. Old newspapers were a favorite among the middle class. Corn cobs were the go-to in rural areas. Leaves, if you could find them, and reusable rags for those who could wash them. The wealthy? They had soft clothes or even sponges, but most people just used whatever was on hand. And since most bathrooms lacked running water, hand washing after using the toilet wasn't exactly standard practice. Imagine that. No soap, no sinks, no sanitation. And with that came disease. So many diseases. Cholera was the main killer, sweeping through London like a storm, claiming thousands of lives at a time. Poor neighborhoods bore the brunt because their sanitation was the worst. But the disease didn't discriminate. Rich people died too. What made it all worse was the lack of understanding. This was before germ theory, before people understood that diseases were caused by bacteria or viruses. They blamed bad air or foul smells wafting from sewage and decaying trash. Can you picture living in a world where sickness struck without warning, and doctors couldn't explain why? Treatments? You can say they were creative. Physicians burned sulfur or tar to cleanse the air and prescribed strong-smelling herbs to purify the home. Patients were given opium or alcohol in massive doses to fight the infection. None of it worked. Families were devastated, losing multiple members during each outbreak. Children especially stood little chance. All the while, sewage flowed into the Thames, the same river people drank from. It's hard to fathom, isn't it? But one man, Dr. John Snow, connected cholera to contaminated water, not bad air. He even proved it. But the medical community thought he was nuts. It wasn't until years later, after the Great Stink and the introduction of a proper sewer system, that his theory gained traction. By then, countless lives had been lost. How frustrating must it have been for Snow to hold the answer but watch it dismissed by those with the power to save lives. Even after the new sewer system was built, old habits persisted. People dumped chamber pots out of windows, threw garbage into the streets, and let factory waste flow into rivers. Behavior doesn't change overnight, after all. Gradually, though, Londoners began to understand. Rivers weren't just convenient dumps. They were water sources. The new sewers were a beginning, not a solution. Over the years, treatment plants were added, better pumps were built, and regulations tightened. Slowly, London transformed from one of the dirtiest cities in the world to one of the cleanest. And here's the irony. This incredible infrastructure is invisible to us today. We turn on a tap, and clean water flows. We flush, and waste disappears. We walk down streets that don't reek of sewage. It's all so seamless, so taken for granted because it works so well. But for Victorians, every trip to the privy was an ordeal. Every sip of water, a gamble. Every breath carried the stench of decay and disease. Even their fashion reflected the filth they lived in. Dark colors were popular. They hid stains. Heavy fabrics lasted longer between washes. Patterns and embellishments disguised smudges. Clothing wasn't just about looking good. It was about surviving in a grimy world. Women's long skirts were a practical necessity. They swept the streets, picking up mud and filth, but they protected legs and shoes from exposure to the grime. Men's dark wool suits served a similar purpose, blending in with coal dust, horse manure, and sewage splatters. It was survival clothing, functional and resilient. Yet, despite the muck, Victorians carried on. They fell in love, celebrated birthdays, raised families. They wrote poetry, painted and made music. They found joy amid hardship. The transformation from the chaos of the early 1800s to the relative cleanliness of the early 1900s saved millions of lives. It made modern urban living possible, proving that even the most overwhelming problems can be solved with ingenuity and determination. But if you really want to understand how tough life was, consider women's hygiene during that time of the month. Those modern, convenient products we barely think twice about, they didn't exist. Women had to be resourceful. Most used rags, literally strips of old cloth torn from clothes or linens. These rags were reusable, which was economical, but cleaning them was a hassle. First, they had to be rinsed in cold water. Hot water would set the stains, then scrubbed with soap and finally hung to dry. But where? You couldn't just hang menstrual rags on a clothesline outside. That would have been scandalous. So they dried them in bedrooms, basements, or wherever they could find privacy. For wealthier women, options were slightly better. Perhaps softer fabrics or private washing facilities. But no matter your class, it was a chore, a necessary, unspoken task that added to the already long list of daily challenges. It wasn't just hygiene that was difficult, it was the societal stigma around it. Menstruation wasn't discussed openly. Women handled it quietly, discreetly, and in discomfort. Modern solutions have revolutionized this aspect of life, turning a burdensome chore into something manageable. Back in the streets of Victorian London, meanwhile, the transformation of sanitation was slow but steady. The sewer system laid the foundation for a healthier city, but it didn't solve everything. Rivers were still polluted, public awareness was limited, and regulations were weak. Yet, over time, improvements continued. Treatment plants were added, neighborhoods connected, and waste management systems refined. factories faced stricter rules on what they could dump. Gradually, the city became a model for urban cleanliness, its foul history fading into the background. Today, we barely think about the systems that make this possible, but it's worth remembering the struggles of those who lived without them. Victorians adapted to a world we can hardly imagine, a world where disease was random and cruel, where every drink of water carried a risk, and where survival often came down to sheer luck. Even in their fashion choices, in the way they built their lives, you can see their resilience. They worked with what they had, striving for dignity and comfort in a world that offered little of either. A comfortable sigh escapes as you take a moment to appreciate modern conveniences. Back in Victorian times, hygiene was a challenge that cut across all classes. Even wealthy women, who could afford softer fabrics or purpose-made cloths, weren't immune to the same endless cycle. Rags, washing, reusing, repeat. Imagine handing over your most intimate laundry to a servant, knowing they'd likely gossip about it in the servants' quarters. Privacy was a rare luxury, even for the privileged. And the middle class? They managed with ingenuity and perseverance. Rags torn from old clothes were rinsed, scrubbed, and hung to dry, often in hidden corners of bedrooms or basements, away from prying eyes. These women juggled the demands of household chores, children, and the societal expectations of perfect appearances, all while dealing with the challenges of limited hygiene products. Doctors of the time had little understanding of women's health. Menstruation, for instance, was often misunderstood and shrouded in myths. Some believed it caused hysteria or temporary insanity. Treatments for these supposed ailments were bizarre and dangerous. Cold baths, bloodletting, and even mercury doses. Yes, mercury, the same substance we now know to be toxic. Your breathing slows, sinking deeper into the story, as you think about the risks these women faced simply trying to alleviate their discomfort. The first disposable menstrual products didn't appear until the late 1800s. Even then, they were bulky, awkward, and expensive. Pads required special belts to keep them in place. And tampons were rudimentary wads of cotton without applicators. Most women couldn't afford them, sticking with rags well into the 20th century. Speaking of rudimentary solutions, Victorian medicine was both innovative and terrifying. Without knowledge of germs or bacteria, doctors relied on wild guesses to treat their patients. Bloodletting, for instance, was the go-to remedy for nearly every ailment. Too much blood, they reasoned, was the cause of most illnesses. Feeling weak? Too much blood. Headache? Definitely too much blood. Doctors would use leeches, knives, or cups to drain their patients, believing they were restoring balance to the body. Imagine lying on a table already ill as someone removes the very thing keeping you alive. Nice and easy, just breathing, as you think about how terrifying it must have been to seek medical help when the cure was often worse than the illness. And mercury. It was the wonder drug of the Victorian age, prescribed for everything from syphilis to teething babies. Of course, mercury is incredibly toxic, causing brain damage and organ failure over time. But doctors didn't know that. They administered mercury freely, unknowingly worsening their patients' conditions. The new symptoms, ironically caused by the treatment, often led to more mercury prescriptions in a vicious cycle. Then there was opium, the era's answer to every pain. Couldn't sleep. Take opium. In pain? Opium. Crying baby. Yes, even infants were dosed with opium-laden syrups, like the infamous Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was a household staple, calming fussy babies almost instantly. Your shoulders drop, releasing tension, as you realize how dangerous everyday life was when addiction wasn't understood. Opium, though effective at dulling pain, was highly addictive. Housewives used it for cramps, workers for back pain, and parents for their children. Dependency took hold quickly, creating widespread addiction that was seen not as a medical condition, but as a moral failing. And surgery. Surgery was a last resort, something you endured only if death was the alternative. Anesthesia didn't become widely available until the late 1800s, and even then, it was risky. Before that, patients underwent procedures fully conscious. Imagine having a tooth pulled, a limb amputated, or a tumor removed while wide awake. Surgeons worked as quickly as possible, often relying on assistants to hold patients down during the ordeal. Infection was almost guaranteed, as doctors didn't sterilize their tools or wash their hands. They'd move directly from examining a diseased corpse to performing surgery, spreading deadly bacteria. Hospitals were so rife with infection that many people preferred to stay home, trusting their immune system over medical intervention. A yawn escapes as you think about how far we've come, from unsterilized operating rooms to modern hospitals. And dentistry. That was a horror show in itself. Most people avoided the dentist until the pain became unbearable, at which point the only solution was extraction. Early dentists, or more often barbers and blacksmiths, used crude tools to yank teeth out with brute force. There was no anesthesia, only a leather strap to bite down on and a prayer that it would be over quickly. For those who could afford dentures, the options were grim. Early models were made from wood, animal teeth, or even the teeth of corpses. George Washington famously wore dentures, crafted from hippo ivory, held together with gold wire. They didn't fit well, making eating a chore and speaking difficult. Most people simply lived without teeth, eating soft foods and avoiding wide smiles. Your breathing deepens, settling into the story, as you marvel at how resilient people were, despite the challenges they faced. Victorians valued beauty and went to great lengths to achieve it. Pale skin was considered ideal, symbolizing a life of leisure. Women used parasols, gloves, and veils to avoid the sun. But if that wasn't enough, they turned to makeup. Cosmetics of the time were a dangerous gamble. Lead-based powders promised a porcelain complexion, but caused lead poisoning over time. Rouge and lip stains often contained mercury. Hair dyes weren't any better, frequently laced with toxic chemicals like lead. Yet, despite the risks, people persisted, driven by the era's rigid beauty standards. Fashion, too, reflected the realities of a dirty world. Dark fabrics and heavy materials were practical, hiding stains and lasting longer between washes. Women's skirts swept the streets, collecting mud and filth but keeping legs and shoes relatively clean. Men's dark wool suits served a similar purpose, camouflaging coal dust, sewage splashes, and other street grime. A gentle sigh escapes as you marvel at the conveniences we take for granted today. Back in Victorian times, beauty and hygiene were as complicated as they were hazardous. Take face powder, for instance. Lead-based powders were all the rage, giving women that sought-after pale complexion. The fact that lead could cause brain damage, organ failure, and eventually death? Just a minor inconvenience ignored in the pursuit of looking fashionable. Imagine women dabbing their faces daily with something that was slowly poisoning them. Rouge wasn't any better, often made with mercury. Lipsticks contained lead, and eyeliners were crafted from antimony, a substance known to cause blindness. Picture preparing for a fancy evening out, delicately applying layer after layer of these toxic concoctions, hoping to look radiant but inadvertently risking your health every single day. Hair care was no easier. Without shampoos or styling products, Victorian women had to get creative. Need some hold for your curls? Sugar water worked wonders. Want to add a bit of shine? Beer was the solution, but washing hair? That was a monthly luxury at best. Layers of sugar, beer, pomade, and powder built up into a sticky, smelly helmet over time, producing an aroma that was unique. Wealthier women often opted for wigs instead. But wigs came with their own set of challenges. These towering masterpieces, sometimes adorned with jewels, feathers, or even miniature sculptures, were heavy, hot, and perfect breeding grounds for lice. Cleaning them required trips to specialists, and wearing the same wig for weeks at a time often led to scalp infections. Can you imagine the discomfort of balancing a lice-infested work of art on your head just to stay fashionable? Men had their fair share of grooming struggles too. Shaving, for instance, was a daunting task. With straight razors, essentially sharp knives, with no safety features, men had to master the art of shaving without injuring themselves. Most visited barbers, but shared razors weren't sterilized, and a quick shave often resulted in infections or skin diseases. Facial hair was the safer option. Beards and mustaches, while trendy, also served a practical purpose. They reduced the risk of daily shaving mishaps. However, they had their own quirks. Mustaches acted as filters for the Victorian air, trapping food particles, tobacco, and city dust. While they might have saved time on shaving, maintaining them was another story entirely. As you breathe deeply, you're reminded of how much simpler modern grooming is. Even bathing, a basic act of hygiene, was a luxury. Public baths were the solution for those who didn't have facilities at home. But these weren't the relaxing spas you might imagine. Public baths were communal pools, used by dozens of people, sometimes hundreds. The water wasn't changed often, and there was no filtration or disinfection. Diseases spread easily among bathers, turning these spaces into breeding grounds for infections. Yet for many, this was the only chance for a full-body wash. Despite the risks, people flocked to public baths, often treating them as social hubs. Imagine sharing gossip while soaking in murky water with strangers, a mix of necessity and community bonding. Despite their many struggles, Victorians found ways to feel good about themselves. They valued clean hands and faces, nice clothing, and pleasant breath. These small acts of self-care became symbols of dignity in a world where personal hygiene was anything but easy. They adapted, building tolerance for conditions we'd find unbearable today. Children played in streets filled with garbage and sewage, their laughter echoing through the filth. They helped with household chores, fetching water and managing chamber pots, all while finding joy in games and storytelling. For children, this was normal. They were resilient, growing up in harsh conditions and learning to thrive despite them. Even in wealthier households, life wasn't without challenges. Childhood mortality was heartbreakingly high, and diseases claimed lives indiscriminately. Yet families celebrated milestones, clung to hope, and cherished moments of happiness. It's a testament to the human spirit's ability to find joy, even in the darkest circumstances. Your muscles relax further as you think, about how these families persevered. Food, a necessity we often take for granted, was another daily challenge. Without refrigeration, preservation methods were inventive, if not downright questionable. Salt was used liberally, packing meat until it was mummified. While it lasted longer, the result was tough, salty, and stripped of nutrients. Smoking was another popular method. Meat hung in the smokehouses for weeks, absorbed carcinogenic flavors, turning it into a chewy, smoky relic of its former self. Bread was often adulterated with cheaper materials like plaster or chalk, making it barely edible. Milk sellers diluted their product with dirty water and added chalk to make it appear fresher. And yet, meals brought people together. Families gathered around tables to share what little they had. Recipes were passed down, traditions upheld, and joy found in simple acts of cooking and eating. Now, let's talk about their health. The Victorians' approach to medicine was, well, experimental at best. Without an understanding of germs or modern pharmacology, treatments were often more harmful than the illnesses themselves. Bloodletting was common. Doctors believed that draining blood cured everything from headaches to infections. Mercury was another miracle cure, prescribed for everything from syphilis to depression. Of course, mercury is toxic, and many patients succumbed to mercury poisoning rather than their original ailment. Opium, too, was widely used, available over the counter and prescribed for pain, sleep, and even crying babies. Addiction was rampant, though poorly understood, with dependency blamed on moral failings rather than medical causes. Surgery was an ordeal most avoided unless absolutely necessary. Without anesthesia, procedures were excruciating, with patients held down by assistants as surgeons worked quickly. The risk of infection was almost certain, as sterilization wasn't yet practiced. Hospitals were often seen as places to die rather than recover. Dentistry, too, was primitive. Toothaches were endured until the pain became unbearable, at which point extraction was the only option. Early false teeth were carved from wood, animal bones, or even the teeth of the deceased, creating a macabre yet practical solution for the toothless. Still, Victorians didn't let these challenges define them. They lived vibrant lives, celebrated milestones, and created art, music, and literature that continues to inspire us. Beauty standards thrived, with pale skin symbolizing elegance. Women used parasols, gloves, and even lead-based powders to maintain their fair complexion, unknowingly harming their health. Even hair was a canvas for creativity. Women's wigs often featured elaborate decorations. Some even had miniature gardens or ships. Men embraced facial hair trends, and their mustaches became a hallmark of sophistication despite their practical challenges. Imagine sitting down to a meal, your stomach growling in anticipation. But instead of a neatly packed fridge or a clean kitchen, you're faced with an overwhelming uncertainty. Nothing feels safe to eat. Welcome to Victorian times, where every bite was a gamble, and survival often trumped taste. Take pickling, for example. It wasn't just a quirky hobby or a way to enhance flavors. It was survival in a jar. Almost everything was pickled. Onions, cabbage, eggs, even meat. The sharp vinegar might keep the bacteria at bay, but it coated every meal in an acidic tang that lingered for hours. Imagine enduring months of meals that tasted overwhelmingly like vinegar, the sharpness burning your tongue, while you hoped it would at least keep sickness at bay. And if pickling wasn't an option, desperation led people to far riskier methods. Food on the brink of decay wasn't thrown out, it was salvaged. Meat turning green? Smother it in spices, cook it until unrecognizable, and hope for the best. Milk starting to curdle? Transform it into cheese and ignore the sour smell. Bread growing moldy? Trim off the worst spots and eat what you can. Can you imagine the bravery, or perhaps the sheer hunger, that it took to eat meals you knew might harm you? Take a moment to breathe. Think about the invisible privileges we have today: expiration dates, refrigeration, and clean water. For the Victorians, none of this existed. Every meal was a risk, and every sickness was a mystery. Milk was especially dangerous. Vendors often diluted it with water to increase profits. But that water, it was the same contaminated source everyone drank. Parents thought they were feeding their children something wholesome, only to discover, too late, it was laced with disease. For mothers who couldn't breastfeed, the alternatives were heartbreaking. Babies were fed cow or goat milk, often spoiled or mixed with water that carried deadly bacteria. Infant mortality soared, leaving families devastated time and again. Even the wealthiest weren't spared. They may have had better kitchens and cooks, but the food itself came from the same questionable sources. Fancy banquets featured exotic fruits, shipped across oceans, arriving bruised, rotten, or crawling with insects. Spices were prized, not just for flavor, but to mask the unmistakable taste of decay. Imagine being at an elegant Victorian dinner party, the room buzzing with laughter, while you nervously chew on a piece of meat, wondering if the pepper hiding its flavor is also hiding its danger. For the poor, the choices were even grimmer. Markets for second-hand food thrived, selling meat that smelled faintly of rot, bruised vegetables barely holding their shape, and dairy that curdled in the container. Vendors hawked pies made from mystery meat and bread packed with sawdust to stretch the flour. Yet hunger made all of this tolerable. When you have mouths to feed and nothing else to give, you learn to ignore the flies, the sour smells, and the visible decay. Even street vendors, a common source of quick meals, operated under no regulation. Food sat in the sun for hours, covered in dust and God knows what else. Yet people flocked to these stalls, not because they trusted them, but because they had no other choice. And then there was alcohol. It became the accidental savior for many. Beer and wine, with their fermentation processes, were often safer than water. Imagine children starting their day with small beer. A weak brew they drank like we drink milk today. Workers carried pints to the factory floor not to get drunk, but to avoid contaminated water. Even babies were sometimes given diluted alcohol, their tiny bodies absorbing substances we now know are harmful. Pause for a moment. Think about the everyday safety nets we take for granted. Hand washing, refrigeration, expiration dates. They weren't just missing in the Victorian era. They were unthinkable luxuries. Cooking, too, was a hazard. Cross-contamination wasn't understood. Imagine slicing raw meat on a wooden cutting board, then using the same unwashed surface to prepare bread. Kitchens were hotspots for disease, but people didn't know. How could they? Science hadn't yet connected the dots. Factory workers and miners faced even harsher realities. Covered in soot and grime, they ate meals with unwashed hands right where they worked. Coal dust mingled with their bread. Chemicals seeped into their meager lunches. Can you picture that? Trying to satisfy your hunger while knowing the very air you're breathing might be killing you? Even rural workers weren't spared. Agricultural laborers handled manure all day, then ate with those same hands. Disease ran rampant in villages, yet the idea that washing your hands could save your life was still revolutionary. Despite these grim realities, people didn't just survive, they lived. Families gathered for meals, even if the food was humble and unsafe. They celebrated, loved, and hoped for better days. Children played in streets filled with filth, their laughter ringing out above the chaos. Wealthy Victorians, for all their privilege, were equally constrained by ignorance. Elaborate feasts became a gamble, with dishes sitting out for hours, breeding bacteria. And yet, they indulged in delicacies that sound horrifying today, like potted meats left to ferment, or maggot-filled cheeses that were somehow considered gourmet. Spices were a saving grace, not just for their taste, but because they helped disguise food gone bad. Strong flavors like cinnamon or pepper became shields against decay, turning spoiled food into something edible, if barely. Take another deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. Imagine the sheer resilience of people who lived through this, finding joy in the small moments despite the constant threat of illness. Public health laws didn't exist for much of this time. Vendors could legally sell rotten meat, diluted milk, and contaminated water without fear of punishment. Reformers fought for decades to bring about change, but progress was slow. By the time food safety laws were introduced, countless lives had already been lost. Think of it. You're in a crowded Victorian marketplace. The air is filled with shouts of vendors hawking their goods, the clatter of horse-drawn carts, and the ever-present smell, a mix of fresh produce, unwashed bodies, and something slightly off. You stop to buy milk hoping it's fresh, but here the milk is watered down as well. The water, likely from a nearby pump contaminated with sewage. Bread looks appealingly white, but that's probably because it's mixed with chalk or alum. It's unsettling, isn't it? Back then, there were no regulations, no food safety inspections. You just had to trust that the vendor wasn't selling you something harmful. Of course, that trust was often misplaced. Fraud was rampant, beer was diluted, sugar was cut with sand, and even tea leaves were recycled by drying and reselling used ones. Think about this. Every meal was a gamble. For the wealthy, there were ways to mitigate the risk. Trusted suppliers, personal cooks. But even they weren't safe. Imported delicacies sat for months in ship holds with no refrigeration, arriving half spoiled. And those grand dinner parties with endless courses. The food sat out for hours, breeding bacteria in ways that would horrify us today. For the poor, things were far worse. They shopped in second-hand food markets where vendors sold bruised produce, spoiled meat, and stale bread no one else wanted. Hunger made them desperate. Imagine a mother feeding her children food she knows might make them sick because the alternative is starvation. The heartbreak must have been unbearable. Now take a second to think about your last meal. It was probably fresh, safe, and stored in a clean refrigerator. You didn't have to question it. That wasn't even a possibility for most Victorian families. And it wasn't just food that was risky. Basic hygiene was a constant struggle. Bathing was rare. Wealthier families might bathe once or twice a week, and even that was considered excessive by many. The belief at the time was that too much bathing could weaken the body or make you sick. So, many simply wiped down visible parts, hands, faces, and called it a day. For working-class families, bathing was a luxury they could barely afford. A long day in the factory left little time for soap and water, and besides, clean water wasn't easy to come by. Still, social pressure to appear clean was growing. People washed what they could, kept visible clothing presentable, and hoped no one noticed the rest. Then soap began to change things. Early Victorian soap was harsh, expensive, and made from animal fat and lye. It could strip your skin raw if you weren't careful. But over time, cheaper and gentler versions became available. Suddenly, families could afford soap for different purposes: gentle ones for skin, stronger ones for laundry, medicated soaps for skin issues. Advertising also played a role in shifting attitudes. Companies linked soap to beauty, health, and success. They promised that using their products would make you more desirable, more refined, more respectable. While these ads might seem laughable now, they worked. Hygiene became not just a necessity, but a status symbol. At the same time, science was catching up. Germ theory, once a radical idea, was gaining ground. For the first time, people began to understand that diseases weren't caused by bad air or moral failings, but by tiny organisms you couldn't see. Doctors started recommending hand washing, sterilizing surgical tools, and isolating sick patients. Mortality rates in hospitals began to plummet. This newfound knowledge was transformative. Schools started teaching children about hygiene, and those lessons spread to families. Public health campaigns encouraged people to wash their hands, keep their homes clean, and properly dispose of waste. Imagine how empowering it must have felt to learn that you could protect your family from illness with such simple actions. Still, change came slowly. Old habits and beliefs died hard. Even wealthy families who could afford daily baths hesitated, clinging to outdated ideas about health and cleanliness. For the poor, progress was even slower. When your daily goal is survival, investing in soap or clean water feels impossible. Pause for a moment. Think about the systems that keep us healthy today. The tap water we drink without a second thought, the safety labels on food packaging, the regular trash collection that keeps our streets clean. All of these things were unimaginable luxuries back then. Food safety eventually started improving, but not without a fight. Reformers and scientists worked tirelessly to push for regulations. It wasn't until the late Victorian period that the first food safety laws were passed, and even then, they were minimal and poorly enforced. Vendors could still sell spoiled meat or adulterated products, but the idea of oversight was beginning to take hold. Meanwhile, the poor continued to make do with what they had. Spoiled food wasn't thrown away, it was repurposed. Green-tinged meat, cover it with spices and cook it thoroughly. Curdled milk, turn it into cheese. Moldy bread, cut off the worst parts and eat the rest. People developed iron stomachs because they had no other choice. And let's not forget public health measures, or the lack thereof. Public baths became popular in some areas, offering a chance for a full body wash. But these baths were shared spaces with unfiltered water, used by dozens of people. While they were an improvement, they were also breeding grounds for disease. Despite all of this, people persevered. They found pride in small victories: clean hands, a tidy collar, a well-brushed coat. They adapted to their circumstances, showing incredible resilience. Even in the face of these challenges, life went on. Families gathered for meals. Women spent hours preparing for special occasions, and children played in streets filled with mud and garbage. People found joy where they could, celebrating milestones, telling stories, and dreaming of a better future. Medical practices were evolving too, though not always for the better. Early Victorian medicine relied on treatments like bloodletting and mercury, which often did more harm than good. Surgery was a last resort, done without anesthesia or sterilization. Yet, as germ theory gained acceptance, hospitals began implementing basic sanitation measures, and survival rates improved. By the late Victorian era, public health campaigns were in full swing. Posters and pamphlets taught people about hand washing, waste disposal, and disease prevention. Schools incorporated hygiene lessons, planting the seeds of change for future generations. Are you wondering how people managed to feel beautiful or confident in an era when soap was a luxury and basic hygiene was almost an afterthought? Picture a Victorian woman standing before a small cracked mirror, preparing for a rare evening out. Her best dress, carefully maintained over months of wear, is laid out. Her only piece of jewelry, a modest brooch passed down through her family, adds a touch of elegance. She carefully dabs perfume on her wrists, hoping its fragrance will last long enough to mask the reality of daily life. In that moment, despite the grime and hardship, she feels beautiful. She feels prepared to face the world. It wasn't just vanity, it was survival. Beauty wasn't about perfection. It was about finding joy and self-worth amid daily struggles. The wealthier you were, the more tools you had to combat these challenges. The rich could afford imported soaps, elegant perfumes, and luxurious fabrics. Yet even they weren't immune to the limitations of their time. Running water was a rarity. Understanding germs was still in its infancy, and medicine was more experimental than effective. What's even more ironic is that the people ensuring the wealthy looked clean and polished often lived in worse conditions themselves. Maids scrubbed floors, laundered clothing, and emptied chamber pots all day, only to return to overcrowded homes with no proper bathing facilities. Butlers and footmen served meals in pristine uniforms, concealing unwashed hands beneath white gloves. In those days, cleanliness wasn't just about hygiene, it was a marker of social status. To appear clean was to demonstrate success, discipline, and morality. For the working class, maintaining the illusion of cleanliness required Herculean effort. They'd scrub their hands and faces, keep their visible clothing immaculate, and pray no one looked closer. But things began to change, though slowly and painfully. The catalyst, the Great Stink of 1858. Can you imagine a smell so bad it shut down Parliament? The Thames River, loaded with human waste and industrial runoff, became an unbearable source of stench and disease. It was a crisis no one could ignore. Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system became the city's salvation. Intricate network of underground tunnels wasn't just about diverting waste, it symbolized hope. For the first time, people realized that change was possible. Imagine walking by the Thames and breathing fresh air instead of gagging on its foul odor. This transformation sparked broader conversations about public health and urban reform. If a sewer system could solve such an enormous problem, what else could be achieved? Cleaner streets, safer working conditions, and better housing became achievable goals. Women were at the forefront of these efforts. As the ones most intimately involved in maintaining family health, they understood the urgent need for change. They organized, lobbied, and demanded better sanitation, clean water, and access to health care for all. Think about the courage it took for these women to stand up in a society that often silenced them. They weren't just fighting for clean homes. They were fighting for survival, for the chance to see their children grow up healthy, for dignity in a world that often denied them even that. Meanwhile, scientific breakthroughs began to reshape the world. Louis Pasteur's germ theory revealed the invisible enemies causing illness. For centuries, people had blamed bad air, moral failings, or sheer bad luck for disease. Now they had proof that tiny organisms were to blame, and that these organisms could be combated with simple measures like hand washing and proper sanitation. The implications were revolutionary. For the first time, people could take steps to protect their own health. Washing hands, boiling water, cleaning wounds, all became acts of empowerment. Yet change didn't come easily. Old habits died hard, and traditional beliefs were slow to fade. Imagine being a parent in that era, learning that something as simple as washing hands could save your child's life. It must have been both liberating and heartbreaking. Liberating to have a solution, heartbreaking to realize how many lives had been lost without this knowledge. Slowly, public health campaigns spread the message. Schools taught children the importance of hygiene, who in turn shared these lessons with their families. Posters displayed the benefits of clean living. Doctors emphasized prevention alongside treatment. And it worked. Child mortality rates began to drop, and people started living longer, healthier lives. This progress created a ripple effect. With better health, people had more energy to work, learn, and improve their living conditions. As hygiene improved, so did society. The wealthy, as always, led the way. But for once, progress trickled down. Affordable soap became widely available. Public health measures protected everyone, not just the privileged. By the late Victorian era, cities like London were transforming. Streets were cleaner, water was safer, and food was less likely to kill you. Imagine what it must have been like to experience this change firsthand. To live in a world where every sip of water or bite of food was a gamble, only to suddenly have access to safety and cleanliness. It must have felt like a miracle. But the change wasn't just physical, it was psychological. People began to believe that cleanliness and health weren't luxuries reserved for the elite. They were basic human rights. This shift in mindset would lay the foundation for the public health systems we rely on today. And yet, even in the darkest days, people found ways to celebrate life. Women would spend hours brushing their hair, donning their best dresses and dabbing on perfume for special occasions. Families would gather to share meals and tell stories, finding joy amid the grime. Have you ever stopped to think about how simple and comforting our daily routines are? Imagine brushing your teeth, washing your face, or slipping into clean pajamas. These moments might seem mundane, but they're the culmination of centuries of progress, struggles, and dreams. Now, picture living in a time when clean water was a luxury, sanitation was a distant concept, and hygiene was often a matter of life and death. How would you find comfort in a world like that? In Victorian times, an era of grandeur and elegance for some, but also of unimaginable struggles for many. Imagine a world where every breath you take might carry danger. A time when the air you breathe, the water you drink, and the streets you walk are all potential threats to your health. This was the Victorian era, a period of stark contrasts, bustling progress, and unimaginable challenges. For many, it was a time of survival, not living. The women of the time, the unsung heroes in countless homes, bore the brunt of these challenges. They weren't just caretakers, they were warriors fighting silent battles against disease and despair. Picture them waking up at dawn, scrubbing floors, boiling water, nursing the sick, and still finding the strength to hope for something better. Can you imagine the resilience it took to not just endure, but to act? They formed organizations and movements, determined to make change happen. Public health, child welfare, sanitation reform. These weren't just abstract ideas to them. They were urgent needs, matters of life and death. They fought for cleaner water supplies, better housing laws, and access to medical care for the poor. Doesn't it amaze you how they turned their struggles into fuel for progress? At the same time, the scientific world was undergoing a quiet revolution. The work of pioneers like Louis Pasteur began to challenge long-held beliefs. Until then, many thought diseases were caused by bad air or divine punishment. But Pasteur and others uncovered a new truth. Microorganisms, invisible to the naked eye, were the real culprits. Can you imagine the shock and the hope that this revelation brought? For the first time in history, people could understand why they got sick and what they could do to prevent it. Hand washing, once a mere social nicety, became a medical necessity. Cleaning wounds was no longer just about appearances, it was about survival. Proper food storage became a matter of life and death. Doesn't it make you think about how simple acts, which we now take for granted, became the pillars of life-saving practices? But knowledge alone wasn't enough. Changing hearts and minds proved to be another battle entirely. People clung to old habits, resistant to new ideas that seemed to challenge their traditions. Even well into the 20th century, many still believed in outdated explanations for disease. Can you blame them, though? Change is hard, especially when it upends everything you've ever known. Yet slowly the message began to spread. Schools started teaching hygiene as part of their curriculum. Doctors began focusing on prevention as much as treatment. Public health campaigns encouraged hand washing and sanitation practices. Imagine the ripple effect, how these small, simple ideas started to transform entire communities. The shift wasn't just practical, it was deeply emotional. For generations, people had accepted disease as an inevitable part of life. But now, for the first time, they began to believe they could fight back. They realized they deserved better. Can you feel the hope that must have blossomed in their hearts? A hope that life could be more than just survival, that it could be healthy, clean, and full of possibilities. This hope translated into real, measurable progress. Child mortality rates began to decline. People started living longer, healthier lives. Diseases that once terrorized communities became manageable, even preventable. And as people's health improved, so did their ability to work, to dream, to build a better world for themselves and their families. Isn't it incredible how interconnected everything is? The wealthy, as always, were the first to reap the benefits of these advancements. They could afford better soap, cleaner water, and access to medical care. But over time, these improvements trickled down to the working classes. Basic health care became more accessible. Public health measures like clean water initiatives and waste management began to protect everyone, regardless of social status. Doesn't it inspire you to see how collective progress can benefit even the most vulnerable? By the end of the Victorian era, cities like London were almost unrecognizable. What was once a cesspool of filth and disease beginning to transform into a cleaner, healthier place to live. Imagine walking through streets that no longer reeked of waste, drinking water without the constant fear of cholera, and eating food with a newfound sense of safety. Can you picture the relief, the gratitude, the sheer wonder of it all? But perhaps the most profound transformation was a psychological one. For the first time, people began to view health and cleanliness as fundamental human rights, not privileges reserved for the elite. This shift in thinking drove reforms in housing, working conditions, and social services. Doesn't it make you wonder how much of our modern world is built on this simple yet revolutionary idea? The people who fought for these changes didn't live to see all the benefits. Many spent their lives battling the very conditions they were trying to improve, yet they persisted. Why? Because they believed in a better future, not just for themselves, but for generations to come. Isn't that kind of selflessness deeply moving? To fight for a world you might never get to enjoy, simply because you know it's the right thing to do? Think about the challenges they faced. The Great Stink, a crisis that turned the Thames River into a flowing sewer, seemed insurmountable. Cholera outbreaks, mysterious and deadly, took thousands of lives without warning. Yet they persevered. They built sewer systems, discovered the link between contaminated water and disease, and developed strategies that saved countless lives. Their resilience reminds us that even the greatest obstacles can be overcome with determination and collaboration. Now, consider your own life. The hot shower you took this morning, the clean clothes you're wearing, the safe food you ate, all of these everyday comforts exist because of the groundwork laid by Victorian reformers. Doesn't it make you pause and feel a deep sense of gratitude? They couldn't have imagined the world we live in today. Antibiotics that cure once deadly diseases, water treatment plants that provide clean drinking water to entire cities, food safety regulations that prevent most illnesses. But they dreamed of a cleaner, healthier world. And they took the first steps to make that dream a reality. As you lie in bed tonight, think about their legacy. The fresh air in your room, the clean sheets on your bed, the running water in your home. These aren't just conveniences, they're victories in the fight for human dignity. Each one represents the struggles and sacrifices of countless people who believed that a better world was possible. Let your body sink into the comfort of your bed as you reflect on the progress we've made. Your breathing slows, becoming more rhythmic as you imagine the connections between the past and the present. You are part of their legacy, a living testament to their hope and determination. And as you drift off to sleep, remember this: the story of human progress isn't over. The challenges of the Victorian era may be behind us, but new ones await. Access to clean water and sanitation remains a struggle in many parts of the world. Poverty still leaves millions vulnerable to disease. Social inequality continues to shape health outcomes. But we've come so far, and we have tools, knowledge, and inspiration they could only dream of. So tonight, as you close your eyes, let yourself feel the weight of their efforts and the lightness of their victories. Know that you are surrounded by the results of their hope, their persistence, and their courage. And perhaps as you sleep, you'll dream of ways to continue their legacy, to contribute to the ongoing story of human progress. After all, their story is ours, and it's a story worth continuing